positive reception that Silent Hill 2 Remake has received since its release in October, the franchise has finally managed to win back the fanbase after nearly 2 decades of it underperforming and disappointing survival horror fans all around the world. Now, because of what Konami and Bloober Team accomplished, the future of the Silent Hill franchise has never looked brighter. With that in mind though, today I want to take a stroll down memory lane as we take a look at the history of Silent Hill. More specifically, we'll be taking a look at one of the most disturbing features in the Silent Hill franchise, the boss fights. Something that Silent Hill has always delivered on are extremely challenging, yet innovative and disturbing bosses. Throughout the 13 mainline games of the series, we the players have struggled to take down some of the big baddies of the series, to the point where we might find ourselves rage quitting at times. So on this episode of Nerdspace Games, I'll be diving into the Silent Hill franchise as I give you guys the most difficult boss fights of the entire Silent Hill series. For today's video, we'll be taking a look at each fight from the perspective of playing it on the most difficult gameplay setting in each game, as that's where these bosses truly showcase how challenging they can be. Also, we'll be taking a look at each of the fights from the perspective as though it was our first time encountering each boss fight, and without any sort of guides or tricks that we've learned over the years. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is the top 10 hardest boss fights in Silent Hill. Let's get it. Number 10, Floatstinger, Silent Hill. Floatstinger is the perfect example of a boss being difficult mostly thanks to the gameplay mechanics of an older PlayStation 1 game rather than the boss itself being difficult. Rather, it's a giant bat in Resident Evil 0 or this massive behemoth of a moth. Flying enemies in older classic survival horror games do not go well together at all. Just as my good friend Conjure Line, the dude hates flying enemies in survival horror games. To make matters worse, Floatstinger can attack the player from a distance no matter where you stand thanks to its long range acid attack. And if you try to get too close to it, then it'll give you a taste of its massive stinger. To be fair, it's in the name, Floatstinger, so yeah, you probably should have seen that one coming. Number 9, Asphyxia, Silent Hill Homecoming. Rather, I'm making a list of the most disturbing bosses or the hardest bosses of Silent Hill. Multiple big baddies from Silent Hill Homecoming will end up taking up a big chunk of either list. That's because they are equally as disturbing looking as they are a pain to fight against. To avoid repeating myself too much in later entries, know this, the melee system in Silent Hill Homecoming, yeah, it's the absolute worst. The controls are clunky and the attacks from any enemy in the game, let alone a boss with multiple limbs, can be challenging to dodge or block in this game. And guess what? Asphyxia has multiple fucking everything. So imagine how difficult it is to take on the same mechanic that's been kicking your ass all game and then put that shit on steroids, because that's basically what you get with this boss fight. Whether it's her forearms brutally beating you down, her 360 tailspin attack, or her annoying screech that sends Alex flying, Asphyxia will really test your patience, and if you haven't been practicing your timing with your dodges, then you're absolutely screwed in this fight. Number 8, Splithead, Silent Hill. Some Silent Hill fans are going to look at this entry, look at me, and then laugh on my face when I tell them that Splithead is one of the most frustrating boss fights in the entire Silent Hill franchise. And maybe you guys have every right to do so, and I just let anxiety get the best of me in this fight, but that's not going to stop me from including him on this list. Anyway, considering that Splithead is the first official boss fight of the entire franchise, it's honestly surprising how difficult he can be to kill. First off, the player doesn't have that many guns, bullets, or healing items due to this fight being early on in the game. Plus, the shotgun, the only other gun that the player can get before this fight outside of their handgun, is actually pretty easy to miss if you don't know where to look. But when you do finally decide to take it on, you'll soon realize where it gets its name from. During the fight, this creature will split its head into two, in which it'll try to kill you in a single attack. Get too close to it when it's splitting its head open like this and you'll immediately die. To make matters worse, guess where its weakness is? Inside of its mouth, when it opens up to instantly kill you. And it only opens up when you get close enough for it to, well, you know, eat you. Failure to realize where its weak spot is could result in you wasting all of your ammo, especially if you're lacking a certain handy dandy shotgun, which ultimately leaves you screwed as you have no other choice but to melee a boss that can instantly kill you if you get too close to it. Peachy. Number 7, Scarlet, Silent Hill Homecoming. Shocker, another Silent Hill Homecoming boss cracks today's list, and spoiler, it won't be the last. This time we look at one of the scariest enemies of the entire Silent Hill franchise, Scarlet. Since I already gave you the whole crappy melee mechanic spiel, I'll skip over that part. Instead, let's dive into the boss itself. Like many boss fights in horror games, Scarlet has two phases. Phase 1, she is covered in thick armor plates that protects her limbs. In order to defeat Scarlet, you'll need to damage these plates enough to activate a QTE, in which you'll successfully remove the plate. Do this enough and you'll eventually enter phase 2, which is when things get pretty tricky. And what will probably be your longest boss fight in the entire Silent Hill franchise, Scarlet will constantly keep you on your toes as she crawls all over the battlefield and leaps across the map to do massive damage to you. Because of the lack of resources that you'll probably have at this point after making your way through one of the more challenging areas in the game, Scarlet will make you pay if you come unprepared for your fight against her. Number 6, Memory of Alessa, Silent Hill 3. While both Sybil of Silent Hill and Eddie of Silent Hill 2 can be a bit frustrating to deal with, neither of them compare to the Memory of Alessa in Silent Hill 3. Whether it's a survival horror game like Silent Hill 3 or a Soulsborne game like the Mimic Tier in Elden Ring, fighting an AI controlled version of yourself is never a fun experience. If you're like me, it doesn't take long into that fight for you to eventually realize that you might not actually be the badass that you thought you were for a majority of the game. Anyway, in Alessa's case, you have to contend with 4 different versions of her, each fight having a different weapon that you carry in your own arsenal. This includes a knife and a steel pipe for close range attacks and a handgun and machine gun for long range attacks. Perhaps the most frustrating element of this fight though is the fact that Alessa is notorious for positioning herself behind obstacles, blocking your bullets, and dodging your attacks, making it extremely frustrating to land any critical hits on her. Sure, this fight is definitely much easier once you learn that the katana is your best friend, but that's not something that most of us realize on our first playthrough of the game without a guide or a walkthrough. Number 5, Mary/Maria, Silent Hill 2. One of 2 perfect examples on today's list of the original Silent Hill 2 featuring a boss fight that is 10 times more difficult on hard than they were on normal is Maria, the final boss of the game. While it could be argued that Maria is one of the easiest boss fights on normal, fighting her on hard is a completely different experience. The most difficult part of this fight comes from one of her attacks, the chokehold. See, when playing the game on hard, this chokehold is Maria's most vicious attack as it's extremely hard to dodge and it deals a massive amount of damage. Try anywhere from a third of your health to about half of your health in a single attack. And if you think you can just keep your distance and shoot her from long range, well then you better beware of her deadly moths that she sends after you to deal damage and slow you down so that she can get closer to you. And guess what she loves doing to you once she gets close to you? Yep, you guessed it, chokehold. Granted, there is a trick that I've never tried on my own before in which you can apparently enter the battle with no ammo and the fight will end on its own after a predetermined amount of time, but 1, I'm not sure if that's available on every port of the game, and 2, it's highly unlikely that you knew about this trick during your first playthrough of the game. Number 4, Incubus, Silent Hill. While there are technically 2 different final boss fights in Silent Hill, both of which can be really challenging on hard, the fact is that everything about the Incubus is just much more difficult than its much prettier looking counterpart, the Incubator. For 1, the Incubus can receive more damage before it finally dies. And 2, unlike the Incubator, the Incubus is not stationary and can fly around while dealing its very powerful lightning attacks to make quick work of Harry's health. Unlike most boss fights in this game, it's actually really difficult to dodge attacks throughout this entire battle. Rather, it's the insane range of the lightning attacks from the Incubus or the very small and contained battlefield that you find yourself in. It's extremely difficult to walk out of this fight completely unscathed, let alone at all. Oh, and let's not forget that the original Silent Hill has a more clunky gameplay experience overall, and maneuvering the camera in this dark and cramped space compared to other games is a challenge in and itself. As with any classic Silent Hill game, there is the no ammo failsafe in place in which the player could just survive for a certain amount of time, but even that could prove to be more difficult than it sounds thanks to the wide range of its attacks and the small battlefield. Plus, I've already said this before, the no ammo trick is not necessarily something that you'll come across on your own in your first playthrough of the game anyway, so we're not even going to count that for any of the entries in the classic Silent Hill games. Number 3, 2 Pyramid Heads, Silent Hill 2. Fun fact, but the 2 Pyramid Heads boss fight in the original Silent Hill 2 game is actually the only boss fight in the top 5 that is not a final boss of their respective game. Yet this fight on hard is no joke to the point where I've actually found myself still having trouble with this fight even 2 decades after the original game's release. Yeah, it's still that challenging for me even with all of those different guides and walkthroughs out there nowadays. While every other encounter with Pyramid Head is fairly simple to deal with, including the remake's version of this fight, going into this fight unprepared could lead to a very frustrating experience. Not to state the obvious, but facing off against 2 Pyramid Heads compared to 1 means that dodging their attacks is twice as difficult. And sure, while these attacks are fairly simple to dodge as long as you keep your distance, the true challenge of this fight is making sure you can get off enough shots at them before they get close enough to land one of their devastating attacks. For me personally, after dealing with one of the more difficult locations of the game, I've always seemed to enter this battle with low resources. So for that reason, I tend to run out of ammo before the fight is over, thanks to the amount of damage each of these guys can receive. On top of that, my healing items are pretty low by this point as well, so when I'm forced to switch over to melee, they usually kick my ass before I can finish them off. To make matters worse, the original game of course plays with the classic dynamic third-person camera angle versus the modern over-the-shoulder mechanics seen in the remake. What this means is that it can be difficult to pinpoint either of the pyramid heads fast enough to fire off a couple of shots before they reach you and punish you for taking so long. Number 2, Amnion, Silent Hill Homecoming. Silent Hill Homecoming loves torturing the players when it comes to the boss fights. Whether it's Scarlet's speed and endurance or Asphyxia's multiple limbs and attack patterns, the game really doesn't hold back in pushing us the players to our limit. Yet, as you would expect from the final boss of the game, nothing will challenge you more than Amnion. Again, we'll skip the frustrating gameplay mechanics that make this fight even more unbearable to avoid repeating myself, but this fight essentially combines the things that we hated the most about every boss fight of the game. While the fight does not drag on as long as Scarlet's fight, Amnion is arguably the second longest fight of the entire game thanks to her having much more health than most of the other bosses of the game. And like Asphyxia, Amnion also has multiple limbs in which the player will need to block or dodge in order to avoid receiving massive damage. That's because in this fight, Amnion has 6 mechanical arms for you to deal with. Unfortunately, the pain doesn't stop there though. Amnion is arguably the fastest boss in the game, making Scarlet look slow at times, and she can make her way across the battlefield faster than you can react to it. And even if she didn't want to get close and personal with Alex, she has her very own long range attack in the form of vomit that she can shoot at Alex, basically turning this fight into one that requires you to have patience and timing down to a T if you want to come out of it alive. And yes, there's a phase 2, so good luck if you're playing Homecoming on the hardest difficulty. Leave it to someone that calls themselves the God to be the most difficult boss fight of the entire Silent Hill franchise. While on paper this fight might seem simple enough thanks to God remaining stationary throughout the entire fight, its limited yet highly efficient attacks are enough to make you break your controller out of frustration. As with most of the boss fights on today's list, the final boss of Silent Hill 3 is of course in a small battlefield. And as you would imagine for one of Silent Hill's largest monsters, each of her attacks cover about half of the entire battlefield. To make matters worse, God can use both long range and short range attacks, meaning that there is no safe space in this entire arena. If you choose to shoot at her from a distance, you'll be met with a quick flame attack that will deal massive damage if it manages to land. But close range is just as dangerous thanks to her swipe attacks that'll drain Heather's health before you know it. So how do you beat her? Well, the gamer inside of me will tell you to manage your resources, time your attacks, and never stop moving so that you could avoid most of her attacks. The coward inside of me though tells you to use a strategy that kind of cheeses this fight. Essentially, you can shoot her while dodging her fire attacks from long range, and then when she bends down to get up close and personal, move to her right side and deal damage with the katana. Sure, you'll get hit every now and then, but trust me, it's much easier to do this than the alternative. But again, this is a strategy that I'm sure you won't realize unless you've watched guides or spent hours fighting God multiple times before you figured out this trick on your own. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is God the hardest boss fight in Silent Hill, or is there a different boss that deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always guys, I'll catch you on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.